Hey guys, tonight we're not easing in with a gentle rain shower or a crackling fire. No, tonight we open with a rope stretched so tight it could cut your palms, a storm brewing overhead, and a god leaning with every ounce of strength he has. This isn't a fairy tale where thunder politely rolls across the sky. This is a bedtime story pulled straight out of Norse mythology, where the sea itself hides a monster big enough to strangle the world. Picture it, Thor, heavy-handed and red-bearded, standing in a creaking wooden boat. The ocean is black glass, broken only by the hiss of waves against the hull. He's holding a line baited with the head of an ox, dropped deep into the cold belly of the sea. Somewhere below, the world serpent Jörmungandr shifts. The water trembles, as if the earth itself is waking up. Thor's jaw locks, his knuckles pale, and in that moment, you can almost feel his heartbeat syncing with your own, that tight rhythm between fear and courage. This isn't just a story about gods smashing giants. It's about what happens when you pit raw strength against inevitability, when even thunder feels small against the weight of the sea. And as you settle in tonight, think of this: you and I are passengers on that fragile boat, waiting to see whether Thor will haul up the serpent or be dragged under with it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how far this sleepy little time machine reaches. Close with this line before you transition into the immersive story now. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The boat groans like an old house in the wind. Hymir, the giant whose boat Thor has borrowed, sits at the stern. His eyes are pale and cold, the kind of eyes that have seen storms swallow whole crews and not blinked once. He told Thor not to bother with the deep waters. Too dangerous, he muttered. Too much beneath the surface. But Thor is not a man who listens when fear speaks. The ox's head, massive, raw, dripping, sinks into the darkness. For a while, nothing. Just the slap of waves against wood, the steady pull of tide tugging at your stomach. And then it comes. The line shivers, not the quick, jerky bite of a fish, but a slow, dreadful movement, as though the sea itself has wrapped around the bait. Thor braces, planting his boots against the planks, his arms tense, muscles grinding, the belt of strength tightening around his waist. The rope cuts into his palms, but he holds on. He pulls, and something pulls back. The surface stirs, first a ripple, then a swell, then a wall. The world serpent rises, its body coiling around the horizon, each scale glistening like wet stone under what little light breaks through the clouds. Its eyes yellow, endless fix on Thor. For a heartbeat, even thunder itself holds its breath. Thor raises Mjolnir, his hammer, the weapon that cracks mountains. You know the strike is coming. But Hymir panics. The giant slashes the line. The rope whips back, stinging Thor's hands, and the serpent slides back into the abyss with a hiss like 1,000 waves breaking at once. The sea is quiet again, but not peaceful. It's the quiet of unfinished business. Thor sits, his breath heavy, his anger heavier. He's tasted the fight that will end the world, and he knows this isn't the last time their paths will cross. The storm passed, but Thor did not forget. He rarely does. He carries anger the way other men carry tools, always close, always ready. Yet anger is not all he carries. Beneath the hammer, beneath the belt of strength and the iron gloves, there is something simpler, the stubborn sense of duty that makes him more than just a brawler. Thor belongs to the people, not the throne. Odin sits in high halls, cloaked in riddles and ravens, weaving long plans in the shadows of prophecy. But Thor, he walks the fields. He hears the prayers muttered by farmers when clouds gather too heavy and frost cuts too deep. He is not worshipped through incense and golden temples, but through the cracked hands of men and women who need the rain to fall or stop. Picture him now, not on a battlefield, but at a homestead, a wooden fence sagging against the push of wild things, a family watching the horizon with unease. Thor's chariot rumbles in, pulled by goats whose hooves spark against the stones. He steps down, shoulders broad, beard tangled, eyes sharp as the northern wind. To the children, he looks like a mountain given legs. To the parents, he's a promise that the giants, the frost, the flood, the hunger will not swallow their world tonight. He does not smile easily, but he listens. That is his gift, too often forgotten. Thor kneels, pressing his palm into the damp earth. He feels where it is too wet, where the river threatens to break its banks. He promises them protection, not with words, but with the way he grips his hammer as if it were part of his own arm. And in that moment, Thor is not a god. He is a worker. He is the man who fixes what is broken, who holds back the flood until morning. There is comfort in that, comfort enough to fall asleep to, knowing someone is standing watch while you rest. Yet strength has a shadow. The people see a protector, but Thor sees himself as a wall, and walls are meant to be tested. He knows every time he pushes back one giant, another rises. Every season brings new hunger, new cold, new fear. He is not building a kingdom, he's patching a fence that will always break again. That is why his hands are calloused, not just from the hammer, but from the endless repetition of holding the line. There are stories of Odin disguising himself as a wanderer, seeking wisdom from seers and witches. Thor has no patience for riddles. He does not ask what will happen. He meets what happens head on. Some call him simple for this, but simplicity can be strength. He does not waste time doubting himself. Doubt is a luxury for men who can afford hesitation. Thor cannot. Still, there are nights when the storm lingers in his mind, nights when he remembers the serpent's eyes, glowing beneath the waves. In the silence after battle, when even the goats sleep, Thor feels the weight of inevitability pressing against his chest. He knows he cannot stop the end forever. He can only slow it, and slowing it must be enough. But the world rarely lets him linger in thought. Trouble always arrives. Sometimes it's a pack of giants, shouting their way toward Midgard's borders. Other times it's a village too far gone with fear, needing to see the hammer raised before they believe in dawn again. When Thor appears, he brings weather with him. The sky darkens, the air grows heavy, as though even the clouds answer to him. He's not polished like the other gods, not adorned with poetry or charm. He is blunt force wrapped in red hair and stormlight, yet in that bluntness lies his beauty. He does not pretend. He does not promise what he cannot deliver. He only fights and keeps fighting until the danger is pushed back long enough for people to live another day. That is why he is loved, not admired, not feared loved. His cult spread not in royal courts but in the dirt and timber of ordinary lives. Archaeologists have dug up hundreds of little hammer amulets, worn close to the chest. Not gold crowns for Odin, not sea offerings for Njord, but tiny Mjolnirs for Thor. Farmers wore them, blacksmiths wore them, mothers gave them to children, because Thor was not distant, he was theirs. Imagine that every time thunder rolled over the fields, they didn't hear a threat, they heard reassurance. The protector is awake. The storm is his hammer coming down, and the giants will scatter for another day. Thor doesn't explain himself with clever words. He explains with action, swinging the hammer, standing unbroken in front of the gate, laughing with the roar of the sky. To the giants, that laugh is terror. To Midgard, it is hope. And hope, for Thor, is a duty. He cannot put it down any more than he can put down Mjolnir. When you live as a wall, you accept that you will never move forward. You will always hold your ground. That is the price of being the working-class god. But even walls crack. And the story of Thor is not just about how he stood. It is about how he began to bend, and what finally broke him. Nights sank like ink over the rafters, and the goats settled, and for once the world felt steady. That was when trouble arrived, wrapped in laughter. Loki's kind of laughter, thin, bright, a knife wearing bells. Thor was oiling the iron gloves he used to grip hot metal and lightning both. He didn't look up when Loki slid into the doorway, all grin and restless shoulders. There was soot on Thor's hands, and a patience to the way he worked the cloth over leather. Small circles, steady breath. He had the peace of a man who'd split enough wood to quiet the mind. Loki watched that peace the way a fox watches a henhouse. "Tell me something, brother," Loki said, as if the word didn't have splinters. "How much do you love that hammer of yours?" Thor's eyes cut to him. Enough. Enough to risk it. The room cooled. Somewhere beyond the homestead, thunder tested its voice across distant hills, then swallowed it again. polite as a cough. Thor set the gloves down. Say what you came to say. Loki sauntered in, tracing a finger over a gouge in the table, a souvenir from some night of hurry and hunger. The dwarves, he said, drawing the word out. Brokkr and Sindri. They are forging wonders again. Gifts fit for kings. A spear that never misses. A ring that breeds rings. Things that make gods nervous and kings feel small. I thought, what could they make if truly challenged Thor waited? So I wagered, Loki said softly. I told them no dwarf could craft a treasure better than the ones I have already won from their kind. I may have mentioned your hammer. I may have used the phrase easily surpassed. And tiny detail I put up my head as collateral. Thor's jaw worked once, twice. Your head? Oh, they were thrilled, Loki said, delighted at his own doom. You know how craftsmen give them an insult and they'll build a cathedral to answer it. I said, beat my best or try to take my head. They said, leave the head, we want the impossible. And here we are, Thor ran a thumb along the seam of his glove. What's the price for us? Only this, Loki said. Let them forge for you. Stand at the bellows. Bring your steadiness. Let us see whether their pride is heavier than your patience. Thor could have said no. He could have said the world was already loud enough with pride. But he thought of the fence line, and the river that waited for spring to burst its banks, and the serpent coiling in the dark under the sea. He thought of the way a tool, once made, outlives 1,000 prayers. We go, he said. The road to the dwarves' forge ran like a vein through the mountain, its walls sweating old fire. Down there, sound doesn't travel, it shudders. Brokkr and Sindri stood like two thick roots torn from the earth, beards braided, eyes bright as furnace mouths. There was no ceremony. The older dwarf jerked his chin toward the bellows. If your hands are steady, he said, you'll prove it now. Thor gripped the handles. Leather whispered. Air leapt into flame. Sparks swarmed. Jealous stars. Sindri set a pigskin pouch on the anvil and turned to his brother. First, he said, let us make a gift for the one who thinks himself above storms. He drew from the pouch a boar's skin and a whisper. Some charm men forgot when they learned to farm, then plunged it into the coals. Do not stop, he told Thor, no matter what happens. The air baked, the iron glowed, then blazed, then became that colour that makes men remember their ancestors and the first light they stole. Thor kept the bellows moving, breath in, breath out, the rhythm of work. Ash painted his knuckles grey, sweat crawled down his spine. Loki lounged against a pillar, bored, until the boredom became a grin the kind he wore when a problem asked to be sharpened. A fly appeared, a little nothing, black as a thought you don't want. It landed on Brokkr's neck and bit. The dwarf flinched. Thor didn't. He pumped the bellows. The fly moved, bit harder, a meaner angle, and the dwarf snarled and kept working. When Sindri drew the metal from the coals, it wasn't metal anymore, but a living thing, a boar whose bristles were light itself. Gullinbursti, they called it later, the golden bristled, who could run through night like dawn under his skin. Again, said Sindri, for the Lord who counts everything but mercy. He used a gold ring and a memory of summer, plunged it into fire, and told Thor do not stop. The fly, patient as spite, landed between Thor's finger bones and drove a needle of pain into the flesh. The bellows did not pause. Thor tasted iron near the back of his throat and kept his hands working. When the dwarves lifted the tongs, a ring lay on the anvil, and from it dropped another ring, and then another droop near the dripper. Wealth that made wealth, an echo that never died. Now, Sindri said, voice low, almost tender, as men are before they ask a friend to lift something heavy. Now we make a weapon for a storm that has a face. He set a lump of iron the size of a man's heart into the coals, and said the words that pull shape from stubbornness. Do not stop, he told Thor. And this time Brokkr glanced at Loki as if he smelled tricks. The fly vanished. It returned larger, meaner, hungry for the delicate place where concentration cracks. It landed on Thor's eyelid. The bite was white fire. His eye watered. The world turned into water. But his hands, the hands that had held lines against season fences against winter, did not falter. The bellows breathed. The forge roared. Sindri reached into the blaze, and Thor blinked back tears in time to see the hammer come up from the red. It was not beautiful. It was not elegant or slim. It was squat and blunt and heavy, a promise with sharp edges. Mjolnir, Brokkr said, tasting the word, the crusher. And then Loki laughed softly, not because the hammer disappointed him, but because he had built the trap and sprung it and still found a surprise. The handle was short, shorter than it should have been, as if the hammer had been born in a hurry, pulled from the fire by a midwife with hot hands. Brokkr's eyes narrowed at Loki's mouth. "What did you do?" he said. Loki blinked. Injured innocence. I was only a fly. The dwarves set the gifts on a cloth blacker than coal, a boar who carried daylight, a ring that bred endless rings, a hammer too short, too heavy, somehow perfect. Payment, Sindri said, and he did not mean coin. He meant a wager and the price of pride. Loki's smile thinned. About that head. Thor lifted Mjolnir. The weight settled into him like a truth. He felt the invisible lines that run through the world, the places where fences lean and rivers test their banks, where giants crease the horizon with hunger. The hammer hummed for those places. It wanted to go there. It wanted to meet the problem that needed it. He closed his fingers and the hum climbed his arm, up into the jaw, into the headache place men get when they know they're about to work until dawn. He turned to the dwarves and bowed his head, not like a king, but like a man saying thank you for a tool he knows will save lives. "You have my gratitude," he said. "You have our bill," Brokkr replied, and looked at Loki like a butcher looks at a rooster. "We take the head." Loki's mouth did a quick tour of shapes. "Ah, you see, that wager of course I offered the head, but not the neck." Brokkr's eyebrows climbed. "Not the neck." "One must be precise," Loki said. "Charming as a borrowed dog. You may remove my head if you do not touch the neck, which, as I'm sure you realize, is awkward." There was a long silence, thick with the smell of iron and the fresh-baked awe of a new thing. Sindri sighed, the sigh of a craftsman who understands both the beauty of a perfect blade and the ugliness of contracts. "Tie his mouth shut," he said at last. "If we cannot take the head, we will take the words." They stitched Loki's lips with a strip of leather cured in the same smoke that blackens old forges. He yelped through his nose, a ridiculous, just strangled sound, and Thor, who rarely enjoyed mischief, let the corner of his mouth give way. Just a little. They left with the gifts bundled like newborns. Outside, the mountain let them go by degrees, air cooling the lungs, sky widening until it was more than a ceiling, it was a feeling. Thor set Mjolnir on his palm and tested the swing. The short handle changed the leverage. It demanded closeness. It meant the hammer would always be at home where the fight was tight at gates, on thresholds, in the press of bodies at the fence line. A perfect weapon for a man who lives as a wall. He felt, too, what the dwarves had hidden in it. Blessing. It could hallow a marriage, sanctify a home, make safe the place where a child first sleeps. Not just destroy, repair, not just break, bind. Thunder for giants, tenderness for the hearth. The dual purpose settled into him like a second spine. On the ridge, wind combed the grass into waves. Thor tapped the hammerhead against his palm. The sound was small and heavy, like a heart deciding to keep going. He imagined the serpent again, the curve of it under black water. He pictured the way men would wear little hammers near their bones, hands touching them when storms rolled over fields. He didn't need Odin's riddles to know this was the right tool for the job that never ends. Loki tugged at his stitched mouth and tried to look put upon and noble at once. It didn't work. Thor considered ripping the stitches free, then didn't. Some lessons need a day to set. By the time they reached the homestead, the night had turned kind. Heat drifted from the forge like bread. Thor placed Mjolnir on the table and sat with it, palm flat on the cool metal, as if listening to it breathe. He felt, not for the last time, the pull between two duties to break what threatens and to bless what endures. The hammer would ask both of him. He would answer both. In the dark outside, something big shifted in the sea's sleep. The world held. For now, Thor reached for his iron gloves and slid them on, one by one, with the same small circles, the same steady breath. The goats sighed, the rafters settled, the new weight on the table promised 1,000 mornings, and if the handle was short, well. So are most of the things we learn in time. You make do, you choke up on the grip, you stand closer to the work, you get the job done. Morning broke with a sky the colour of unpolished steel, and the first sound Thor heard was absence. The hammer was gone. His hand groped the table as if it might be hiding in the shadow of his arm, but the wood was bare. Cold rushed into him the way a river does when the ice first cracks. Mjolnir had not walked away. It had been taken. He stormed into Asgard like weather itself. Doors shook. Gods whispered. He stood before Freya, her hair gleaming like sunlit wheat, and he spoke in a voice that rattled rafters. "My hammer is gone." The words carried weight. Without Mjolnir, Midgard was naked. Without Mjolnir, the giants could march as if stepping across a shallow creek, the hall filled with murmurs, half fear, half blame. Loki, lip still sore from the dwarf's stitch, smirked anyway. "I'll find it," he said, the way a man promises to fetch fire from a house already burning. He borrowed Freya's feather cloak and flew, each beat of wing slicing the sky thinner until he reached Jotunheim. There, in the frostbitten halls of Thrym, he found the thief. The giant lord lounged on a throne of bone and boasted before his people. "I buried Mjolnir 8 miles beneath the earth," he told Loki, eyes like glacier ice, "and I will return it only if Freya becomes my bride." Loki returned, Feathercloak trembling, and shared the demand. Freya's fury cracked like kindling tossed on fire. "I will not be handed to a giant like a broodmare." Her necklace Brisingamen flared with light as she stamped her foot. For a moment, the hall dissolved into despair. No hammer, no defence, no chance. Then Heimdall, watchful even when silence reigned, tilted his head with the calm of someone who sees through walls. "There is another way," he said. "Dress Thor as the bride." The silence that followed was so deep even the goats seemed to laugh at it. Thor's beard bristled, his fists curled, to trade his fury for a veil, to let giants jeer at him in lace. But the choice was already made. Either his pride cracked, or the world did. So the gods dressed him. They wrapped him in bridal linen that strained against his shoulders. They draped jewels around his neck and slid Brisingamen's fire against his chest. A red veil hid his face, but not his size, not the storm crouched in his shoulders. Loki, delighted beyond words, flitted beside him in the role of handmaiden. "Keep your eyes soft," he whispered. "Brides don't glare like thunderclouds." The journey to Jotunheim was a play staged in silence. Thor's jaw ached from holding back curses. His heart hammered louder than his absent hammer. When they arrived, Thrym's hall erupted in roars of approval. The giant rose, his crown clattering, his desire wide as winter. "Bring her the feast," he cried. "Bring meat and mead for my bride." Thor sat at the banquet table, veil shrouding his eyes, and ate like a storm eats coastline. Whole oxen vanished into him. Salmon disappeared, barrels of mead drained as if he were a drought swallowing rivers. The giants whispered, nervous. "Never has Freya eaten so fiercely." They muttered. Loki, quick as always, leaned in with a laugh. "Ah, she has fasted for 8 nights in longing for this moment. Love burns away appetite until it all comes rushing back." The giants nodded, though unease rippled through them. Thrym leaned closer, eager to steal a kiss, and when he lifted the veil, Thor's eyes glowed like lightning caught in stone. The giant jerked back. Freya's eyes blaze again, Loki soothed. "Of course they do. She has not slept, dreaming only of you." Desire makes fire of the eyes. At last, unable to wait, Thrym demanded the hammer brought forth to sanctify the marriage. Servants fetched it, heavy, thrumming with storm, and laid it on the bride's lap. That was the end of play acting. Thor's fingers closed around the short handle. The veil dropped like ash in fire. His laughter shook the roof, a roar of release, of fury, of homecoming. He rose, red beard spilling out from bridal silk, and Mjolnir swung. The first strike shattered Thrym's skull like rotten timber. The second sent the high table splintering, meat and bone scattering like refuse. Giants scrambled, but there was nowhere to go. Thor's blows fell like avalanche after avalanche, until the hall was not a hall but rubble, until the air itself smelled of iron and finality. When it was finished, Thor stood alone in the ruin, veil torn, jewels cracked, Mjolnir dripping with certainty. Loki, ever nimble, brushed dust from his shoulders and said, "You do make a radiant bride." Thor did not smile. He set the hammer against his shoulder, and though the world had mocked him for a heartbeat, the world was safe again. Pride can heal, but Midgard's fences cannot if the hammer is gone. Better to be humiliated and alive than noble and destroyed. When they returned to Asgard, the gods greeted him with relief loud as thunder. Freya clasped her necklace, grateful it was not her fate bound in chains. Heimdall bowed his head, the faintest of smiles crossing his lips. Thor did not speak of the shame. He only placed Mjolnir back on the table and rested his hand upon it, as if to say never again. That night, as firelight licked the hall beams and the smell of mead calmed the air, Thor thought of how quickly strength had turned to farce, how thin the line between protector and fool could be. He had dressed in silk to save his hammer, but beneath the veil he had been himself, storm and stone. It taught him something he would not forget: dignity bends easier than duty. He closed his eyes with the hammer at his side, and in the silence that followed, the world just for a night was safe enough to dream. The road out of Asgard unspooled under a sky the colour of pewter, quiet in the way a held breath is quiet. Thor took the high track, the one with frost clinging to rocks and wind worried thin between stones. Loki walked beside him with the quick, light steps of a man who never rests, Tork running ahead like a dog off its leash. Thialfi and Röskva kept pace behind, packs small, eyes wide. Mjolnir rode Thor's palm as if it belonged there. It did, by dusk. The hills had lifted into shoulders. Night settled early, as if the land were pulling a blanket over its head. They found a glade, a small place of brittle grass and a boulder worn to a smooth back by old weather. Thor gathered wood, the kind that burns low and long. Sparks scattered and died. Cold kept returning, patient as a creditor. Then the ground introduced itself with a shudder. Footsteps. Not many one. Big enough to make the fire shrink. From the trees came a shadow the size of a church, ribs like rafters beneath a thick hide. The giant carried a sack slung over one shoulder, knots tight as knuckles. He set it down like a hill deciding to sit. Name Thor asked. Skrymir, the giant replied, voice deep as a well. He glanced at their fire, at the smallness of it, and smiled in a way that warmed nothing. Share your camp, he said, which sounded like a question but wasn't. He lay down with his head on his sack, as if the forest were a pillow made just for him. In minutes he slept, snoring like an avalanche that had learned how to breathe. Thor tried the sack's knot, hungry for food, his fingers working with the patience of a man used to ropes and stubborn latches. The knot didn't move. He pulled harder, and it held harder, as if tied not in rope but in some idea that wouldn't change its mind. Irritation found his jaw. He set Mjolnir softly on the grass, lifted it again softly, then less softly brought it down on Skrymmir's skull. The hammer met bone. The earth sighed. Skrymmir's eyelid twitched. Acorn, he mumbled, and turned his head. Sleep reclaimed him and locked the door. Thor's temper rose, hot and embarrassed. He waited an hour, tried again, this time with the force a man uses when the fence post won't go. The blow thudded. Skrymir scratched his head and muttered falling twig, and rolled to his other side. The night stretched on like a long, thin wire. Before dawn, Thor stood, backed up 3 strides, and brought the hammer down with everything in him. All the storms and all the stubbornness. Birds started out of the trees, somewhere far away. A mountain remembered a new valley. Skrymir sat up, yawned cavernously, and peered around. A gnat, he said, and blinked his slow blink. He heaved his sack over his shoulder and stood. Utgarda is near, he told them, almost kindly. You'll find your match there. He left. Where he had slept, the grass held a dent big enough to bathe a horse. They walked until the woods grew thin, and the land opened into a plain swept by wind so clean it hurt. On the far edge stood a fortress that looked like it had grown out of winter itself. Walls too tall for ladders, gate too high for pride. The hinges groaned like old ice when the doors swung inward. Inside lay a hall filled with giants whose laughter had weight, whose cups could drown a boy. Their king sat at the far end, not a crown and scepter king, a patient king, the kind whose power is a room you keep noticing you're already in. He wore his name lightly, Utgarda Loki. Loki stiffened at the sound, a dog bristling at its own echo, "You've come far," the king said. "Drink. Eat if you can. Nothing here is for show." His smile was not unkind. It was worse than unkindness. It was familiarity with failure. A horn the length of a man was set before Thor, brimming with ale the colour of old honey. "One draught," the king said mildly, "and we'll believe you're thirsty." Thor lifted it. The rim kissed his mouth. He drank. The ale fought back, not in taste but in the way rivers do when you think you understand them. He drank until his chest strained, until the hall blurred. When he lowered the horn, the surface had fallen by what a thumb's width. Laughter bubbled like stew around him. He drank again, longer, until his head buzzed and his arms shook. The ale slid down just enough to mock him. Again! His vision swam. A bead of sweat ran from his temple to his jaw and dropped. The only thing in this hall allowed to finish falling. He set the horn down, breathing hard. Shame a heat no winter could cool. "Curious," the king said, head tilted. "Perhaps lifting will suit you better. We can't have our guest leave without some small triumph." He snapped his fingers. "Bring the cat." They brought it. A grey cat. Big but not monstrous. Eyes like coins. It looked bored in the way only cats and old gods can manage. Thor reached under its belly and lifted. The cat lengthened. He lifted higher and it arched, flowing upward like poured rope. The cat's back rose and rose, stretching into the air and never leaving the floor except for one paw. One paw came up, reluctant as a promise. Thor strained until his shoulders burned. The cat yawned. If a cat could smirk, this one did. The hall hummed with amused approval. "Wrestling, then," the king said, kindness shrinking to its sharp edges. "We have many champions, but it would be discourteous to set you against strength after such a journey. We'll send our old nurse to the ring," he beckoned, and an old woman approached, small, bent, eyes bright with the stubborn light that refuses to go out when the sun does. Thor squared himself. The old woman Ellie, they called her, set her feet and waited, leaning on nothing. Gus, they gripped. Thor tried quickness first, then force, then the kind of force that makes men decide to become poets instead. Ellie did not move. He shifted, tried to find her centre. She had too many. The floorboards creaked. Somewhere a cup stopped ringing. Ellie reached out and gently, inexorably, lowered Thor to one knee. He did not fall. He knelt. There's a difference. But not in that hall. Utgarda Loki stood and spread his hands. "Enough games," he said. His voice carried the quiet that snow carries before it erases a road. "Eat. Sleep. Tomorrow you can retell what you think happened here." They were given pallets in a side chamber where the wind found its way in and then forgot why it came. Loki lay awake and smiled into the dark, smiles having been the only thing he ever learned to sleep on. Thialfi and Röskva traded whispers soft as moth wings. Thor listened to the wood settle, to his own breath, to the small nothings that keep men from breaking. Morning made everything look honest again. The king met them in the yard, hands tucked into his sleeves. Expression changed lighter, almost fond. "I have enjoyed you," he said, and Thor bristled at being a pastime. "I have enjoyed you because you are not what you think and more than you know. It is time to tell you the truth before you leave." He pointed off toward the hills, toward the dent in the forest where a giant had once slept. "Skrymir," he said, as if tasting a good word. "You tried to kill him 3 times. The mountains will speak of it for years. See the cleft there, the next valley. Your hammer did not miss. It never misses. He is simply more mountain than man." He turned to the horn that had mocked Thor, the cat that had unspooled itself into the rafters, the old woman whose hand had weighed more than iron. "You drank from the ocean," he said. "We had the far end in the sea. Your draught pulled the tide out. Fishermen will thank you when the boat's barely on new sand." The catty smiled, very slightly. Was the world serpent. To lift even one paw is to make the horizon remember its manners. And the nurse, that was old age. No one pinned her, not even thunder. That you bent only to your knee is something skalds ought to sing about when they are tired of lying. Loki's eyebrows climbed. He loved truth most when it dressed as praise. Thor's anger loosened in his chest and left something else behind. Something like surprise warmed by respect. He had failed, and the world had moved anyway. The king's expression changed again, shuttered. "I do not expect you to thank me for the lesson. I expect you to leave before you learn a worse one." His hands made a shape in the air, and with that shape the fortress softened. Walls that had been clean lines began to wobble, edges smearing like chalk in rain. The gate sagged into suggestion. Even the ground felt less certain. "We are not built for you," he said gently, "nor you for us." They stepped out, and the plane took them back. When Thor turned to look behind, there was only field and a wind trying not to whistle. They walked in silence for a long time. Thialfi kicked a stone until the stone refused him. Röskva looked at Thor with a child's careful worship. "You drank the sea," she said finally, very soft, as if telling him a rumour about himself. Thor lifted the horn of his chest and let the breath out slow. "No," he said, "I only made it thirsty," but a smile small. Private worked its way into the corners of his mouth. By dusk, the forest had thickened again into something with opinions. They camped beneath firs that held their snow-like old secrets. Thor ate little. The food tasted like his own thoughts, plain, honest, the kind you don't invite guests to. He rubbed the short handle of Mjolnir with his thumb until it felt like an old coin. "Strength is not what I thought," he said into the fire. "What did you think it was?" Loki asked, picking at a knot. "A door you can always open if you hit it hard enough." And now Thor watched the flames lean and correct themselves. Now it's a road with tricks in it. Wind rose, fussed with the branches, settled, somewhere very far off and also not far at all. The sea shifted its weight in the world's bed. Thor listened for the serpent and heard instead his own pulse. Steady, practical, unafraid of work. The night folded around them the way a cloak does when you are too tired to argue. They slept, and though no fortress stood in the dark to humiliate him, Thor dreamed of a grey cat whose paw weighed more than pride, and of an old woman who kept her balance no matter how the world came at her. He dreamed of a horn that would never empty, and of fishermen blessing low tide with hands that had never worn a ring. In the morning he woke, felt the ache in his shoulders where illusions had done their work, and thought good. Better to learn it now. Better to know that even thunder must bow to certain truths, and that bowing is not the same as breaking. They broke camp in silence, the firs behind them holding their snow as if hoarding secrets. The air carried that stillness that comes before trouble, the kind that makes even Loki keep his mouth shut for a while. Thor's boots pressed into the frostbitten ground, steady, certain. Mjolnir hung at his side, the short handle thudding like a heartbeat against his palm. The river appeared sudden as a cut. It stretched wide, swollen from Thor, its surface restless, white foam snarling against stone. Thor knew it at once, the Vimmer, a river that ran not just through land but through story, a threshold few crossed without learning the price of water. They paused at the bank. Röskva's breath curled like a ghost in the air. Thialfi kicked at pebbles and muttered about bridges, as if speaking could summon one. Loki smirked but didn't offer jokes. Even he knew when laughter was bad currency. Thor tied his cloak tighter, then planted his boots in the shallows. The water bit cold, sharp as broken glass. He stepped forward, current tugging at his calves. The river's voice rose with each stride, not just noise but intent. By the time it reached his waist, it wasn't a river anymore. It was a will. From the cliffs above came a laugh low, drawn out, cruel. Thor looked up. There she stood, Gjalp, daughter of the giant Geirröd, hair like tangled floodwater, arms raised in mockery. She had no weapon, only her voice and the river itself. Her spell was simple and merciless. She was urinating into the current, turning the water against him and multiplying it, making the flood itself her ally. The river surged. It climbed his chest, his shoulders. Thor braced, planting Mjolnir against the riverbed, but the pull was monstrous. His boots skidded against slick stone. Röskva cried out from the bank, her hands half raised as if her small strength could anchor him. Thor's mind sharpened the way steel does when struck. He had fought stone giants, shadow giants. Illusion spun out of smoke, but water was different. Water has no edge to catch, no bone to break. It drowns not by striking, but by insisting. His breath came ragged, his eyes burned with salt and cold, and still he moved forward, step by step, each one earned by force enough to grind teeth into powder. He wrenched a sapling from the bank, drove it deep into the riverbed, and leaned his weight against it. The current battered him, but the pole gave him leverage. One more line between him and chaos. The river screamed, swollen by Gjálp's magic. Thor's beard dripped, his arms burned, but he advanced. He pushed again, and when the water rose to his chin, he roared not words, just thunder's raw syllable, and drove himself forward. The sound split the air, and even the river seemed to flinch. With a last heave, he reached the far bank, collapsed to one knee, and planted Mjolnir in the mud. The hammer glowed faintly, humming against the wet ground as if declaring victory. Behind him, the river snarled and spat but could not pull him back. He lifted his head toward the cliffs. Gjálp stood frozen, arms lowering, face pale now, not with power but with sudden doubt. Her eyes met his, and in them she saw what all giants eventually see, not just strength, but inevitability, the promise that Thor would not stop. Thor raised the hammer, water dripping off its head, and pointed it at her without a word. Gjálp fled into the rocks, her laughter gone, replaced by the silence of someone who has learned fear the hard way. The world stilled, the current calmed, slackening as if embarrassed by its own rage. Thor rose, steam rising off him in the cold air, chest heaving. His companions scrambled across the bank, feet slipping on wet stone until they reached his side. "You almost drowned," Thialfi muttered, eyes wide. Thor shook his head. "No," he said. "I almost stopped moving, and that's worse." They walked on, wet clothes stiffening, the sky stretching pale and endless above them. Loki finally spoke, voice soft, thoughtful in a way that unsettled. "Funny thing about water, it doesn't strike. It persuades, like me." Thor glanced at him, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Then I'll treat you like a river," he said. "Cross you, but never trust you." Loki grinned, satisfied to be seen even in insult. That night, they found shelter in a hollow beneath leaning pines. The river's echo followed them, distant but stubborn, like a memory that refused to fade. Thor sat apart from the fire, Mjolnir across his knees, watching sparks rise into the dark. His hand still trembled, not from fear but from the knowledge of how close he'd come to being swallowed whole. Ruskva crept close, hesitant, then sat beside him. She was young, but her eyes carried the kind of honesty that cut deeper than riddles. "You fought the river," she said. "Why didn't you just turn back?" Thor's gaze stayed on the sparks, because the river was waiting for me. Whether today or tomorrow, better to meet it now. She nodded slowly, hugging her knees. Silence stretched, the good kind. When she finally slept, Thor remained, listening to the forest breathe. In the hush, he understood what the river had taught strength is not in striking, but in enduring. A hammer can smash a skull. It cannot hold a current at bay. That part belongs to will, to refusal, to the quiet promise not to give ground even when ground itself is sliding away. And though he knew Gjálp had fled, he also knew her spell had left a scar. Somewhere, rivers remembered that day. Somewhere, floods carried his name in their undertow. Thor accepted it, the way he accepted the serpent, the giants, the prophecy. You don't choose which fights find you. You choose only whether you keep walking after them. He lifted the hammer once more, letting its weight center him, and whispered, "Not for the gods, not for the giants, but for the sleepers nearby, the fences will hold." The wind sighed through the pines as if agreeing, and in that moment, the world, though bruised and wet, felt safe enough to close its eyes. Dawn crawled pale across the horizon, light thin as a blade sharpened too many times. The camp stirred, goats shaking frost from their beards, and Thor rose stiff but steady, his hammer resting across his lap as though it had never left his grasp. The Vimur's roar was now only an echo behind them, but echoes have a way of following, and so did trouble. Word spread faster than fire through dry grass a giant had entered Asgard's gates, not sneaking, not disguised, but swaggering. Hrungnir, stone-headed, stone-hearted, with a voice like gravel being poured into a well had come at Odin's invitation, a dangerous courtesy, that the All-Father sometimes traded wisdom for wages, and this time he'd invited in the wrong guest. By the time Thor returned, the hall was already unsteady with mead fumes and boasts. Hrungnir, drunk and loud, leaned across the high table, slamming down his stone shield as if it were a platter. "I am the strongest," he roared, spraying spit and pride in equal measure. "No god matches me. I could tear Valhalla apart stone by stone. The gods sat tense, glances sliding toward Odin, whose single eye glimmered with the calm of a gambler who always knows the odds, even when they look bad. Hrungnir lifted his whetstone, spinning it in one hand, daring anyone to challenge him. Then the doors thundered open. Thor stepped in, eyes burning, cloak snapping behind him like storm surf. The air shifted. Laughter curdled into silence. Hrungnir turned, squinting through drink, and grinned wide enough to break his face. Here he is, Thunderer himself. Come, little god, face me. No tricks, no riddles, just hammer against stone. Thor's lips peeled back from his teeth. Name the place. Hrungnir slapped his shield at the boundary where worlds meet tomorrow. The deal was struck before mead cooled in its cups. The next day, the field lay bleak and open, sky heavy with the smell of rain. Hrungnir stood waiting, shield raised, whetstone gripped, his body a fortress of granite. At his side lurked Mokokalfi, a clay giant shaped hastily by the Jötnar, taller than trees but trembling like wet clay in a kiln. Fear made his knees weak before the fight even began. Thor's goats drew his chariot across the field, sparks flaring with each strike of hoof against stone. Lightning rippled in the dark clouds above, as though the sky itself leaned down to watch. Thialfi darted ahead, small but sharp-eyed, and he shouted toward Hrungnir, voice carrying in the wind. You stand foolishly. You've left your heart exposed at the front. Unguarded, Hrungnir, stupid with stone and drink, shifted his shield forward to cover what wasn't vulnerable, and left his actual chest wide open. It was the trick Thor needed. The two collided with the sound of continents grinding. Hrungnir hurled his whetstone with a roar, the spinning shards slicing the air like a comet. Thor answered with Mjolnir, their paths crossing in the sky with a shriek that split ears and memory both. The hammer shattered the whetstone into fragments that still lie scattered across Midgard, sharp and unweathered, waiting for bare feet to remember them. But one shard caught Thor's skull, lodging deep. He staggered, blood seeping into his beard, vision flickering. Yet Mjolnir did not falter. It struck Hrungnir square in the chest. Stone cracked, bone cracked, the giant's body falling like a toppled tower. The ground shuddered with his death, dust rising as if the earth itself exhaled relief. Thor fell too, pinned beneath the corpse, the weight of stone pressing down so heavy even thunder felt small. He lay trapped, bleeding, eyes dimming, the hammer just out of reach. The gods cried out, rushing forward, but none could shift the giant's bulk. They strained, cursed, dug fingers into rock-hard flesh, but Hrungnir's weight would not yield. Then came Magni, barely 3 nights old, the child of Thor and the giantess Jarnsaxa, small in years, vast in strength. He walked into the field with eyes bright as his father's storm and placed both hands on Hrungnir's corpse. With the ease of a boy flipping a log for fun, he heaved the stone body aside. Thor breathed again. Air filled his lungs like new fire. He looked upon his son and smiled through the blood. You're your father's gift to the world, he said, voice rough but certain. Magni beamed, proud, but Odin's one eye narrowed. A child of Thor and a giantess had inherited strength greater than any god's blessing, and that thought unsettled the high seat more than Hrungnir's fall had. They carried Thor back to Asgard, but the wound in his skull throbbed and burned. The shard of whetstone stuck fast, lodged like a memory that won't leave. Wise women came with charms and poultices, muttering spells over him. Some whispered he would never heal fully. That thunder itself now rang slightly crooked in his head. Thor didn't care. Pain was familiar. Pain was part of the work. What mattered was that the hammer still answered him, heavy and loyal, and that the giants had been reminded the wall still stood. That night, he sat outside, the sky thick with stars. Mjolnir rested against his leg, the wound pulsing but steady. He thought of Hrungnir's face as the hammer landed, of the stone crumbling into nothing. He thought of Magni's small hands lifting what the gods could not, and he thought of the prophecy that whispered at the edges of his mind, the serpent still turning beneath the sea, waiting for the day Thor would fall 9 steps before it. The shard in his skull ached, echoing that truth. He would fight until his last, and even then it would not be enough to stop the end. But maybe it would be enough to buy the world one more dawn, and that, for Thor, was the only victory worth having. Thunder rumbled faintly on the horizon, soft as a sigh, and Thor leaned back against the wall of the hall, eyelids heavy. He let the sound settle around him like a blanket. Storms would come again. Giants would rise again. The serpent would not sleep forever, but for tonight, the fences held, and Midgard slept safe. And in the quiet that followed, thunder itself seemed to rest. The wound from Hrungnir's whetstone never fully healed. Some nights, Thor could feel it humming inside his skull, a reminder that even thunder can be cracked. Yet he didn't rest long. Giants do not give peace. They sniff out weakness. And one name kept reaching his ears like a splinter. He couldn't ignore Geirrod. This giant was not just strong, he was cunning, cruel in the way that prefers traps to open blows. His hall stood far beyond rivers and crags, a crooked fortress of black rock, its windows burning with orange fire. Travellers whispered of cages that clanged empty one day, and full of bones the next. Thor knew he would have to face him, but Loki, sly as ever, had been there first. The trickster, captured and spared by Geirrod only on condition that he lure Thor into the hall without his hammer, belt, or gloves, returned to Asgard all smooth words and nervous eyes. He urged Thor on, weaving the story of an insult too sharp to leave unanswered. Thor agreed, though unease prickled under his beard. Without Mjolnir, without the belt that doubled his strength, without the gloves that tamed lightning, he felt naked. Still, duty outweighed comfort. When Midgard's safety was the cost, Thor never bargained with fear. The journey to Geirrod's hall was long and raw with cold. The cliffs loomed sharp as teeth. Rivers hissed below, and the wind carried a sourness that tasted like warning. Thialfi walked at Thor's side, eager as ever, but Loki drifted ahead, half smiling, like a man measuring the distance between betrayal and forgiveness. The hall's doors opened with a groan, and heat spilled out, thick with smoke and iron. Inside, the shadows bent wrong, as though the fire itself didn't trust where it burned. Geirrod sat on a throne of dark stone, his eyes deep hollows lit by embers. Around him, his daughters, Gjalp and Gree, long-limbed and cruel-faced, hovered like storms about to break. "Welcome, Thunderer," Geirrod said, voice low, rattling chains in the rafters. "But where is your hammer? Where are the toys that make you dangerous?" His grin split wide. "Leave them at the door." Did you? Thor said nothing. He stepped forward, each boot scraping against the black floor, the smell of metal and blood mixing in his lungs. His hands curled, empty, but not helpless. The daughters moved first. Gjalp, the same who had tried to drown him in the Vimmer, flung her long arms around the pillars of the hall, straining to crush him between them. Greep lunged low, her grip like iron tongs. Thor staggered once, breath rattling, but rage steadied him. He twisted free, seizing a glowing iron rod from the hearth. Heat bit into his palm, but he welcomed the pain. Pain was focus. With a roar, he swung the bar. It struck the first pillar, sparks exploding like startled stars. The rod bent but did not break. He turned and drove it through both daughters at once, pinning them against the timber with a scream that ended in silence. The hall shook, smoke curling thicker, the air tasting of ash and ruin. Geirrod rose, slow and massive, lifting a pair of red-hot tongs, each jaw clamped around a lump of molten iron. He hurled one straight at Thor's chest. For a heartbeat, time froze. Thor caught the iron mid-flight, muscles screaming, skin blistering. He spun, faster than thought, and flung it back with the kind of precision born not of practice but of fury. The glowing mass slammed into Geirrod's body. Fire bloomed. The giant toppled backward, crashing into his throne, which shattered like old bone. His hall trembled. Flames leapt to the rafters. Shadows screamed. The world smelled of burning stone and defeat. Thor stood in the center, chest heaving, hand blistered raw, the iron bar still clutched tight. He was unarmed. Yes, but unarmed for Thor only meant he hadn't yet chosen his weapon. Anything he touched could become an answer. Loki slunk from the corner, eyes glittering, lips pursed in something between admiration and calculation. "I did say it would be interesting," he muttered, voice half drowned by the roar of fire. Thor's gaze cut to him, heavy as the hammer he had been denied. Loki looked away first. Thialfi approached, wide-eyed, voice hushed. "You killed him without Mjolnir?" Thor shook his head, sweat and soot dripping from his brow. "No, I killed him because he forgot what giants always forget. You can strip a man of his tools, but you cannot strip him of his will." The flames spread, licking greedily at the beams. Thor turned, walking out of the hall as it collapsed behind him. The sky above cracked with thunder, though no storm had yet arrived. It was only the sound of the world exhaling relief. On the cliff path outside, the night air cut clean, sharp with frost. Thor flexed his burned hand, skin cracked and angry. He thought of the hammer waiting far away, the belt, the gloves, all useful, all powerful. But what steadied him now was the knowledge that none of them defined him. The world would remember Geirrod's hall not for its cruelty, not for its fire, but for the day Thunder walked in barehanded and walked out alive. Thor looked down into the valley, dark and endless, where rivers shifted like snakes in their sleep. His skull throbbed, his hand burned, his body ached, and still he moved forward, step after step, the same rhythm that kept Midgard safe while the rest of the world slept. Because thunder does not rest, it only waits. The ruins of Geirrod's hall were still cooling behind him when the whispers began another threat, but dressed in cleverness this time, not brute force. Trouble has a habit of changing its costume, but it never stays away for long. By the time Thor reached Asgard again, the council hall was heavy with unease. Odin sat with his ravens hunched like questions on either shoulder, and Freya's face burned with a fury no jewel could soften. A stranger had come to their gates, not a giant crashing through with fire, not a raider with axe and howl, but a builder. He offered them a gift to raise walls so strong even the Jötnar could never breach them. Stones stacked with precision, foundations deep enough to turn the earth itself into a shield. He swore he could finish in a single winter. His price was simple, and it was unbearable: the sun, the moon, and Freya herself as his bride. The hall erupted. Some gods raged, others laughed. Some argued it was safer to refuse outright. But Odin tilted his head, his eye narrowing with that gambler's light that always seems like foresight until the dice fall wrong. "We will accept," he said, "but he must do it alone, and it must be finished in one winter. No help, no tricks. If he fails, he gets nothing." The builder bowed, smiling the way men do when they already smell victory. He called his stallion Svadilfari, and the work began. From dawn to dusk, the horse dragged stone heavier than ships, never tiring, never faltering. The builder set each block with the patience of centuries. Day after day the wall rose higher, each stone biting the sky. The gods watched, unease thickening. They whispered in corners, voices sharp as flint. "He's going to finish. He's actually going to finish." Thor was gone during those first weeks, wandering on his endless circuits of Midgard, guarding borders no one else cared to see. By the time he returned, the wall was nearly whole. Only the gate remained unfinished, and even that would be done before the snow melted. Freya sat silent, her fury hidden behind a face of ice. The sun and moon, though still wheeling above, seemed dimmer for the bargain. The gods turned on Loki. It was always Loki because no one else could undo what they themselves had been foolish enough to agree to. They cornered him, threatened him, promised him pain. "Fix this," Odin said flatly, "or suffer worse than chains." So Loki slipped away, as he always did, changing shape until his body was soft and sleek, until his breath steamed in the cold air, not as a man's but as a mare's. That night, when the builder drove Svadilfari into the snow to haul another stone, the stallion caught the scent of something wild. A mare, dark-eyed, flicking her tail in challenge, neighing soft promises just beyond the tree line. Svadilfari screamed and tore after her, dragging chains and half a boulder behind him. The builder cursed, shouted, struggled, but horseflesh is stronger than oaths when desire burns. All night Svadilfari chased. All night the builder stumbled after, rage boiling in his chest. But the mare was always just out of reach, hooves drumming across frozen earth like mocking laughter. By dawn, the stones lay abandoned, the work unfinished. The builder returned hollow-eyed, realizing what had been done. His disguise cracked. He was no mere man, he was a giant, one who had slunk into Asgard in civility's skin. His roar split the morning, shaking snow from the eaves. He bared teeth, reached for hidden strength, and raised his arms to strike. But Thor had been waiting. He had smelled the deceit from the moment he saw the wall climb too fast. Too perfect. His hammer leapt into his hand, short-handled, blunt, furious. He strode across the half-built courtyard, eyes burning brighter than the torches on the walls. "You ask for our sun," Thor growled. "You ask for our moon. You ask for our Freya. Here is your answer." Mjolnir swung. The blow landed with a finality that echoed down through stone and memory alike. The builder fell where he stood, body crumpling against the very wall he'd raised. The ground trembled once, then stilled. The gods cheered relief more than triumph. The wall remained, massive, strong, its stones testifying to both their folly and their fortune. But behind the cheers, there was unease. They had been willing to bargain away light itself, and only trickery and violence had saved them. Walls may hold back giants, but bargains made in desperation can hollow even the highest stronghold. Thor stood apart from the celebration. He laid a hand against the wall, feeling the cold stone hum beneath his palm. It was strong. Yes, but strength bought with deception never feels whole. His eyes lifted to the horizon, where the serpent still coiled unseen beneath the waves, where frost still whispered beyond the mountains. He knew no wall was high enough to keep out what was coming, but he also knew one thing with certainty as long as he held the hammer. He would never let giants steal the sky. The wall gleamed pale in the morning light. Freya adjusted her necklace and breathed easier. The sun and moon climbed higher, spared for another age. And Loki, somewhere in the wilderness, laughed softly in the body of a mare, already knowing his mischief had planted seeds of consequence that none could yet see. Thor turned from the wall, hand tightening on Mjolnir. Stones could be stacked, bargains could be struck, but in the end, it was always the hammer that settled things. He walked away from Asgard's shining new defences with the knowledge that safety built on trickery never lasts. The gods had leaned on walls. The world leaned on him, and thunder, as ever, kept moving. The wall still shone pale against the morning sky when the hall quieted again. For once, there was no hammer raised, no giant's roar at the gates, only the hearth burning low, the smell of bread in the air, and a kind of fragile peace that always felt borrowed. But trouble doesn't vanish, it waits, slinking through laughter, curling under doors, and in Asgard, trouble wore a familiar smile. Sif slept. Her hair, long and golden, spilled across the pillow like fields of wheat bending beneath summer wind. It was the kind of beauty that wasn't just seen but carried meaning the harvest, the promise of plenty, the comfort of a world that still remembered growth. Thor's hand rested near her shoulder, a small gesture for a man who lived in storms, his breath heavy with the trust of rest. And Loki, restless as ever, crept close. Mischief doesn't always need reason. Sometimes it's hunger, sometimes it's boredom, sometimes it's the cruel delight of watching what others love unravel. With a grin sharp as a blade, Loki lifted his shears. In silence, the golden strands fell, one by one, sliding like sunlight extinguished. When he was finished, nothing remained but cropped stubble, a field raised in the dark. When Sif woke and touched her head, her cry cut sharper than thunder. Thor woke at once, his chest filling with dread before his ears even found the sound. He saw her hair the harvest gone, the beauty stripped. His hands shook, not from fear but from fury. He stormed into the court, the broken locks clutched like proof, and his roar shook every corner of the hall. Who did this? The gods looked at one another, but eyes slid inevitably toward Loki. He leaned against a pillar, smirking, never denying, because denial is for men who fear punishment. Thor advanced, the hammer already rising, jaw clenched tight enough to crack stone. "I will break every bone you have," Thor growled, "and grind them until even hell forgets your name." Loki lifted his hands in mock surrender, smile widening. "Wait, it's only hair. It will grow." Thor's voice dropped low. Dangerous. It was not just hair. It was promise. "You've insulted not just Sif, but the earth itself. You've mocked the fields, the harvest, the hope of men. This is not a prank. This is war on trust." The hall trembled with the silence that followed. Odin's eye pinned Loki like a spear. "Fix it," he said, "before Thunder makes good on his word." So Loki fled not out of fear of death, but of pain too great to gamble with. He dove into the forges of the dwarves, the same brothers who had crafted treasures before. He promised them wealth, favour, and honeyed lies. He begged them for a new creation, strands of gold that were not gold but living light, woven fine as breath, that would root themselves into Sif's scalp and grow like her own hair. The dwarves, proud of their craft, agreed. They shaped the golden locks, shimmering, alive, as though summer itself had been melted and spun into thread. Loki, never content with enough, goaded them further, taunting them, challenging them to make gifts greater still. He had seen how they responded to insult, how their pride built wonders out of scorn. He demanded they forge treasures worthy of gods Odin's spear Gungnir that never missed, Freya's necklace of unmatched beauty, and finally, for Thor, the restoration of what Loki had ruined. When Loki returned, hair in hand, the hall was braced for storm. Thor stood over him, ready to strike. But Loki held up the gift, golden and gleaming, and even Thor's rage stuttered for a breath. He placed the strands into Sif's hands. She pressed them to her head, and before the hall's eyes, they rooted, grew, and flowed new hair, shining brighter than before, each lock alive with a glow that whispered of harvests yet to come. The hall exhaled. Relief, or even laughter spread. Thor stepped closer, his hand hovering near her hair, not daring to touch until she nodded. The silk slid through his fingers, warm, alive, humming with promise. His shoulders eased, the hammer lowered, but beneath the relief was a lesson carved deeper than any stone wall. Loki had turned love into a weapon, peace into vulnerability. The gods saw how easily beauty could be stolen, how quickly trust could be shorn away. And though Sif's hair grew radiant again, the memory of her cry, the look on Thor's face when he thought something precious had been taken forever, those lingered, sharp as blades tucked under cloth. That night, Thor sat beside Sif, his hand resting gently against hers. He said little. Words were not his gift. But when her eyes closed and she leaned against his shoulder, the hammer rested near, silent, a promise made in steel and thunder no one would take from her again. Outside, the night winds rattled the eaves. Mischief slept, but only for a while, and thunder, though calm, never forgot. The fire in the hall burned low, its embers whispering red against the dark. Thor sat in the quiet, one hand wrapped around a cup of mead, the other draped heavy over Mjolnir. Sif's golden hair, restored and shining, fell across her shoulders like a field ready for harvest. For a moment, there was peace, but Thor's mind did not sit still. The giants were never far. To most of the gods, the Jötnar were nothing but monstrous shapes in the night, enemies without depth. Kill them, trick them, wall them off. That was Asgard's creed. But Thor knew better. He had faced them not only in battle, but in silence, in the breath between strikes. And in those moments he'd seen something the others ignored. Giants weren't evil, they were inevitable. A storm isn't evil when it tears down your roof. Hunger isn't evil when it hollows your ribs. Winter doesn't hate you when it freezes your fields. Giants were those forces made flesh, given shape so that men and gods alike could look their enemy in the eye. They weren't villains in a tale, they were the tale. He remembered Skudimir, the mountain-sized wanderer, whose head took 3 blows from Mjolnir without waking. Was that malice, or was it simply scale something too large to care about a hammer strike, the way a man cares about a gnat? He remembered Utgarda Loki, whose illusions humbled even thunder, whose laughter carried not cruelty but perspective. Was that evil, or was it truth, disguised as mockery? Thor took another drink, eyes distant. He thought of Jalp, trying to drown him in the Vima with flood magic. She hadn't done it out of hatred for his face. She had done it because floods drown, because rivers rise, because that's what they do. Giants acted the way rivers act, the way stone falls, the way fire consumes. You don't reason with those things. You stand against them, hold the line, and hope you don't break first. And yet there were exceptions. He recalled Jarl Saxa, fierce and unbending, who had given him Magni, a giantess, yes, but not an enemy, in their son's strength. Thor had seen something more complicated than war. Bloodlines crossed like roots underground, invisible but vital. Not every giant stood on the far side of the wall. Some stood beside it, or even helped raise it. That truth gnawed at him more than the whetstone still lodged in his skull, because if giants were not simply evil, then every swing of his hammer carried more weight than he wanted to admit. Every skull broken might be a wall torn down that didn't need tearing, but he could not stop. The world depended on his strength, not his doubts. Outside, thunder muttered over the hills. Not yet a storm, just a reminder. Thor set his cup aside and rose, walking out into the night air. The sky stretched endless, stars blinking like eyes that didn't care whether Midgard lived or died. He breathed deep, the cold burning his lungs. He thought of the people in their homes, fires low, children curled against their mothers, fathers rising early to tend flocks or mend fences. They didn't care whether giants were evil or inevitable. They only cared whether the walls held until morning, and for that, Thor's hammer was enough. But in his chest, he carried the harder truth every giant he struck down. Another rose. The sea still surged. The frost still crept. Hunger still gnawed. It was never finished. His war was not a war at all, it was maintenance, like patching roofs, like mending fences, an endless cycle of holding back what would always return. And maybe that was the point. Behind him, Loki appeared, silent at first, for once without a joke. He studied Thor, eyes sharp, half-shadowed. "You look tired," he said finally. Thor grunted. "The world is heavy. I carry it." Loki tilted his head, smiling thin. "Giants aren't going away. Brother, beat them, trick them, bury them. It doesn't matter if they'll be back. They're older than your hammer, older than your walls. You fight inevitability. Doesn't that feel useless?" Thor turned, his gaze slow and dangerous. "It feels necessary." Loki chuckled. A soft sound. Not cruel, but weary. Necessary. Yes, but it will break you. Thor lifted Mjolnir, its weight solid in his grip, and looked at it the way a man looks at a tool he both loves and resents. "Then let it. If I break before the wall does, it will have been worth it." Loki's grin faltered for a moment, replaced by something harder to read: pity, maybe, or respect. Then it slipped away, masked again. He melted into the dark with a shrug. Thor stood alone beneath the sky, listening to the low growl of distant thunder. Giants were not evil. They were the shape of challenge itself. To strike them was not to win. It was only to endure. But endurance was enough. It had to be. He closed his eyes, letting the cold bite his skin, and whispered to the night, not as prayer, but as statement. "The fences will hold." The wind moved through the trees like a reply, and somewhere far beyond, in the halls of the giants, another storm was already stirring. The night after Loki's words felt longer than most. Thor lay on the bench by the fire, eyes open, Mjolnir beside him, the embers glow flickering across the iron head. His body ached with the familiar heaviness of battle, but his mind refused to quiet. Somewhere beyond the walls of Asgard, inevitability was waiting, not in the form of giants he could strike, but in a shape no hammer could truly crush. Prophecy. The seeress had spoken long ago, her voice weaving through smoke and silence, and even Odin's deep hunger for wisdom had not shaken it free. The Norns had etched it into the roots of Yggdrasil itself. Thor's fate was not a question, but a sentence already written. He would face the world's serpent at Ragnarok. He would strike, and the serpent would fall. But so would he. 9 steps after victory, 9 heartbeats, then collapse poison gnawing through him until thunder went silent. Thor rose before dawn, restless, and stepped outside. The air was sharp, biting with the promise of snow, though the season hadn't yet turned. He walked past the walls, past the gates, into the open plain where the horizon stretched unbroken. He breathed deep, searching the air for courage, though courage had never been what he lacked. It wasn't fear of death that haunted him. Death was a door, nothing more. What burned inside him was something harsher, the certainty of leaving his work unfinished. The giants would come again, the floods would rise, and though his children might lift the hammer, would the world endure without him standing guard? That thought pressed heavier than any whetstone shard in his skull. A rumble shifted across the sky, low and distant, too deliberate to be thunder. Thor narrowed his eyes. A flock of ravens wheeled above, and then Odin himself approached, cloaked in grey, staff in hand, the one-eyed gaze fixed as steady as the horizon itself. "You walk alone too often," Odin said. "I am never alone," Thor answered. His hand tightened on Mjolnir. "The storm walks with me." Odin's mouth bent into something that wasn't quite a smile. "The storm doesn't change fate." Thor turned, jaw stiff. "You've heard it too." "I have heard it more times than I care to count," Odin said softly. "The serpent waits. You two are bound. Strike, and you will fall. Delay and the world will break sooner. That is the knot." Thor exhaled, breath steaming in the cold. "So what would you have me do? I'd pretend the sea is calm when I know the serpent coils under it. I'm no coward." "No," Odin said, eye gleaming. "That is your gift and your curse. You meet fate head on, and you call it duty." The wind shifted, whistling between them. For a moment, silence stretched, heavy as lead. Then Odin lowered his staff, the runes carved into its length catching what little light bled through the clouds. "Listen to me, Thor. Prophecy is not always a warning. It is a mirror. The Norns weave truth, but truth has threads. Perhaps what matters is not whether you fall, but what your fall buys." Thor's jaw tightened. 9 steps. "Yes," Odin said. 9 steps for a world. That is no small trade. You have always been the wall. Walls do not last forever, but they last long enough for others to live. That is what you are meant to be. Thor's eyes burned, not with tears, but with the heat of understanding he didn't want. To be a wall meant to break eventually. To stand against inevitability meant to accept it would claim you. The prophecy wasn't mockery, it was acknowledgement. Odin placed a hand on Thor's shoulder, rare weight in the gesture. "Your children will carry the hammer. Magni and Modi will walk after you. The world will rise again, though you do not live to see it. Remember that when the poison burns in your veins, that it is not for nothing." Then, as sudden as mist, Odin was gone, the ravens scattering into the sky. Thor stood alone again, Mjolnir heavy in his grip, the cold gnawing through his cloak. He closed his eyes, listening. For a moment, it wasn't wind he heard, but the serpent, shifting in the deeps, its coils rubbing against the ocean floor like continents grinding. He imagined the battle, the line pulling taut, the serpent rising higher than mountains, its breath thick with venom. He imagined his hammer falling, the crash that would split sea and sky. He imagined the silence afterward, his own knees giving, the 9 steps, each one echoing louder than thunder, until the last breath left him. He could see it as clearly as if it had already happened, and still. A grim smile crept across his face, because if that was fate, then so be it. There was no shame in dying with the serpent broken, the sea made still, the world brought another dawn. He returned to the hall, but his steps were slower, more deliberate. Inside, Sif sat with the children, Magni clutching a wooden hammer, swinging it clumsily against a post. Modi laughed, shouting encouragement. The sound filled the hall brighter than any fire. Thor watched. His heart ached and swelled in the same beat. Sif noticed him, her eyes soft but sharp. "What did he tell you?" "The truth," Thor said simply, "that I will fall." Her lips pressed tight. She said nothing more, only reached for his hand, and he let her hold it. The children's laughter filled the silence, and for a moment, Thor believed Odin's words, that even walls, when they finally break, can leave enough behind to build something new. The night stretched long again, but this time Thor lay still. The serpent's shadow coiled across his thoughts, the prophecy heavy but no longer unbearable. He could carry it, just as he carried Mjolnir, just as he carried Midgard's endless weight. 9 steps would be enough. Outside, clouds thickened, and the wind whispered like thread drawn tight on a loom. The Norns were weaving, and thunder was already part of the pattern. The memory of prophecy clung to Thor like smoke on a cloak. Each dawn he woke with the serpent's shadow curling across his thoughts. Each night he slept with its hiss echoing in his chest. And somewhere between those hours, the sea itself seemed to call to him. It was not the quiet call of water lapping at stones. It was the deep pull, the old unfinished challenge, the rope once severed by cowardice. Hymir's boat still waited. Thor knew he had to return, not for glory, not even for vengeance, but because some debts won't sleep until they're paid. The day came when the sky sagged low and grey, the kind of weather that swallows colour, leaving only iron. Thor stood on the shore, Mjolnir strapped at his belt, eyes fixed on the horizon. The surf hissed around his boots like a warning. Behind him, Hymir grumbled, already regretting letting his boat be borrowed a second time. "You tempt death," the giant muttered, pushing the vessel into the surf. Thor didn't answer. His hands gripped the oars, each stroke pulling the boat farther from the safety of land, deeper into water that smelled of iron and endings. The waves slapped, steady as a heartbeat. The horizon stretched, and the world shrank to wood, water, and will at last. Thor baited the line, not scraps, not simple lure, but the head of a great ox, blood running dark across the boards before it slipped into the sea. Silence followed, silence so deep it felt alive. Then the rope twitched, once, twice, a slow drag downward, steady as the turning of the world. Thor braced, arms burning, veins standing sharp against his skin. The boat creaked, tilted, nearly swallowed. He heaved back, the muscles in his back knotted like iron cables, his breath a growl. The sea broke open, Jörmungandr rose, coils unending, scales black-green and slick with ocean, eyes burning like twin suns gone mad. Its body arched across the horizon, so massive the sky seemed smaller for it. The hiss that escaped its throat wasn't sound but pressure, a roar that rattled bone and thought. Thor's jaw clenched, his hands bled against the rope, but he pulled harder, dragging the serpent's head above the waves. The creature's tongue lashed, dripping venom, sizzling as it struck the boards. The stench rolled over them, a choking reek that clawed the lungs. Hymir cried out, stumbling back, "Cut the line, release it before it drags us under." But Thor's eyes were locked, his will fused with the hammer at his side. He rose, feet planted wide, and raised Mjolnir high. The storm answered, clouds bruising overhead, lightning stitching across the sky. The serpent lunged. Thor swung. Hammer met scale with a crash that split sea from sky. The water erupted, waves flinging the boat high, then slamming it down again. Jörmungandr writhed, body thrashing, coils smashing against the sea as if to crush the ocean itself. The venom sprayed, burning holes into the wood, into the air, into the very idea of safety. Again Thor struck, the sound rolling across the horizon, echoing through the roots of the world. The serpent's head reeled back, jaw shattering waves, but it did not fall. Not yet. Hymir, panicked beyond reason, seized his knife. With one slash, he severed the line. The rope snapped back, whipping Thor's arms raw. The serpent slid beneath the surface, vanishing into the deep, its hiss fading like the receding storm. The sea went still. Thor stood trembling, Mjolnir still raised, fury carved into his face. He had been a breath away from ending the prophecy on his own terms, a heartbeat away from striking down the monster that haunted every horizon. And cowardice had stolen it from him. The boat rocked gently now, as if nothing had happened, but Thor's breath came in ragged bursts, his chest heaving. He lowered the hammer slowly, the weight dragging against his arm, heavier than ever. He looked at Hymir, whose hands still shook from the knife. The giant would not meet his eyes. "You fool," Thor said, voice low, dangerous. "Do you know what you've undone?" Hymir said nothing, staring into the sea as though it would rise again any moment. Thor turned back toward the horizon. The serpent was gone, but not defeated. He could feel it still, coiling in the dark, waiting for the day the rope would not break, the day the hammer would not miss. That day would be Ragnarök. The ride back was silent. Each stroke of the oars felt heavier, as if he carried not just the boat, but the weight of inevitability. The shore loomed, grey and indifferent. When they finally dragged the vessel onto sand, Thor stepped out without a word. His boots sank into wet earth, but his spine remained straight. He lifted his gaze to the clouds above, bruised purple and black, thunder muttering faintly inside them. He thought of Odin's words, of the prophecy carved into roots and stars, of the 9 steps he was fated to take after striking the serpent down. And for the first time, he felt the truth not as a whisper, but as a presence standing beside him, as real as Mjolnir's weight in his palm. He clenched the hammer tighter, jaw hard. The serpent had slipped away this time, but next time would be the last. As he turned to leave the shore, the waves lapped gently, as though mocking him, as though reminding him who held patience longer than gods. The storm inside Thor did not break. It only grew. The sea never forgot. It carried memory the way it carried salt, every wave laced with it, every tide whispering what had once happened and what was still to come. Thor walked from the shore that day with Mjolnir heavy at his side, but the weight in his chest was worse. The serpent had risen, he had struck, and still the end had not come. Prophecy had merely been delayed, coiled tighter, waiting for its true moment. That moment came when the world itself began to unravel. The signs arrived one by one, like knocks at a door no one wanted to open. First the sun dimmed, veiled by wolves who chased it across the sky until finally they caught it, their jaws snapping light into fragments. The moon followed soon after, its silver face swallowed, leaving the heavens starless and raw. Then came Fimbulwinter, the great winter, endless and merciless. Snow fell not for a season but for 3 long years without pause, burying fields, choking rivers, freezing the marrow of men. Hunger stalked Midgard. Brother turned against brother, and warmth itself became a memory people whispered about like a myth. Thor moved among them, chariot groaning, goats' hooves sparking against ice-slick rock. Villagers clutched hammer amulets around their necks when he passed, their breath-steaming prayers into the cold air. He lifted roofs caved in by snow, split ice so wells could flow again, drove back wolves that had learned the taste of human flesh. But even he could not stop Winter's hand. He was a wall, yes, but the storm now came from every side at once. One night, as he slept beside Sif, her golden hair spread like firelight against the firs, Thor dreamed. He stood again in Hymir's boat, rope cutting his palms, serpent's head rearing high. But this time there was no coward with a knife to sever the line. This time the serpent came up fully, higher than mountains, its breath filling the sky with venom so thick the stars themselves corroded. Thor lifted Mjolnir, struck, and saw his own legs buckle as poison spread through his veins. He took 9 steps in the dream, each one echoing like thunder across the void, before falling into blackness. When he woke, his jaw ached from clenching. He said nothing to Sif. She studied his eyes, though anew some truth cannot be hidden. Even behind silence, the gods gathered in Asgard, grim faces lit by torches that could not chase the cold from their bones. Odin sat at the high seat, ravens restless on his shoulders, whispering doom in his ear. The All-Father's voice carried no riddles this time. Ragnarok is here. The giants march. The wolf Fenrir runs free. The serpent stirs in the deeps. Thor stood, shoulders squared, his hand resting on Mjolnir's short handle. He said only, "Then I go." Odin met his gaze, and for a heartbeat the hall fell utterly silent. No wind outside, no crackle of flame, no breath from the gathered gods. Just that look, father to son, king to protector, one who weaves fate to one who embodies it. Odin nodded once. That was enough. The day of battle broke not with dawn, but with fire. Surt, the fire giant, rose from Muspelheim, his sword burning brighter than the sun that no longer existed. His flames scorched the sky itself, turning clouds into ash. The earth groaned, split open, spewing rivers of molten stone. The dead marched from hell, their feet pounding like drums across bridges of corpses. The giants poured from Jotunheim, mountains moving, rivers walking, storms given shape, and from the sea the serpent came. The water exploded outward, towering walls crashing onto land, pulling ships into its hunger. Jörmungandr uncoiled at last, body wrapping the horizon, tail vanishing beyond sight, head rising so high it seemed to scrape the roof of the world. Venom spilled from its jaws in rivers, choking air, blackening ground, burning flesh. Every breath of the serpent was a curse. Every coil was inevitability made visible. Thor's chariot thundered across the broken plain, goats shrieking, hooves sparking fire against stone. His red beard blazed in the stormlight, eyes wild and unblinking. He leapt from the chariot before it even slowed, boots cracking earth, hammer raised. His roar met the serpent's hiss, two sounds colliding, shaking Yggdrasil to its roots. The battle between them was not just clash of flesh and bone. It was storm against sea, order against chaos, the eternal refusal of walls to collapse against the endless insistence of waves. The serpent lunged, jaws wide, venom spraying in sheets. Thor rolled aside, Mjolnir flashing, smashing scale and bone. The sound split the air, thunder louder than fire, louder than death. Jörmungandr reeled back, blood black as midnight spilling into the ocean, staining waves that had never known defeat. Thor pressed forward. He struck again and again, each blow cracking scales, snapping teeth, crushing coils. The serpent's body thrashed, smashing forests flat, grinding mountains to gravel. Poison sprayed, burning Thor's skin raw, each breath slicing his lungs like knives. But still he moved, still he swung, still he roared, every strike carrying the fury of a protector who knows he cannot win but refuses to stop anyway. The world around them shattered. Mountains collapsed into valleys. The sea boiled, waves climbing higher than clouds. Lightning tore the sky apart, jagged veins across blackness, answering the hammer's rhythm. And through it all, Thor fought, a man-shaped storm, unstoppable until he chose to fall. At last, Mjolnir landed true. The serpent's skull cracked like ice in spring, its eyes rolling back, its hiss breaking into a final shudder. Jörmungandr writhed, coils twisting, then went still. The sea stilled with it. The venom stopped spraying. For one breathless moment, the world seemed to hold. Thor staggered. His chest burned. His veins carried fire, but not the clean fire of battle. This was venom, thick and black, racing through him like floodwater through broken levees. His muscles clenched, then faltered. His hammer slipped lower in his grip. He forced 1 foot forward, 1 step. The world shook with it. Another step. Thunder cracked above, answering him, as if the sky itself refused to let him fall silent. 3rd step. Venom crawled higher, squeezing his heart, his vision blurred, dark edges closing in. 4th. His breath rattled, torn from him in gasps, but his jaw stayed locked, unbroken. 5th. Each stride echoed louder than the last, as though the ground itself remembered them. 6th. The hammer dragged now, scraping sparks from stone. 7th. The sky bent low, heavy with grief, clouds weeping rain that sizzled against poisoned ground. 8th. His knees buckled, but he forced them straight. 9th. He collapsed. Mjolnir fell beside him, its head sinking into the earth with a dull, final thud. Thor lay there, breath gone, eyes dimming, venom flooding him until thunder was no more. His chest stilled, his hand twitched once, then not again. The storm was silent, yet silence itself mourned. The gods fell elsewhere, the wolf Fenrir tearing Odin, Surt's fire consuming everything, Heimdall and Loki killing one another in the shadows. The world cracked apart, drowned in flame and flood, and still Thor's 9 steps echoed, reverberating through the ruin, refusing to fade, because those 9 steps were not just his. They belonged to Midgard, to every field he had guarded, every fence he had defended, every hearth he had blessed. They were the steps of a man who held the line until the end, who stood against inevitability and made it wait. As fire and flood devoured the world, green shoots already stirred beneath the ash. And somewhere in that new dawn, children would lift the hammer again, Magni, Modi. The line would not break, but for now, Thor's body lay still, face set not in fear but in defiance. The serpent was dead, the protector was down. The wall had fallen, but it had bought the world one more chance. And above, where thunder had always rolled, the sky held quiet, grieving, as if even storms must bow to sacrifice. Ash fell like slow snow. For a while there was no difference between sky and ground, only a grey that tasted like iron and old sorrow. The sea lay stunned, the serpent's corpse settling into its depths the way a nightmare slides back under a closed eyelid. Where waves had reared like mountains, now there were long, shivering flats of water, oil black and quiet, reflecting a sky that hadn't yet decided if it would keep going. Thor didn't move. The hammer lay half buried beside his open hand, its short handle angled toward his palm as if the two of them had agreed to meet again in a minute, and then the minute had not come. The venom had won its argument inside him. Muscles slackened, heat bled away. The roar in his chest went out like a hearth that's run out of wood in the small hours. In the hush that followed, even fire kept its voice down, and yet not everything ended. Ruin has a way of knitting up a silence that breeds small sounds. A drip from a broken beam, the crack of cooling stone, the soft clink where ash meets ash and settles. Between those quiet nothings, the world took shallow breaths. It wasn't alive exactly. Not a whole world, but it wasn't done either. Sif reached him first. No chariot now, no retinue, no fanfare, just a woman walking through ash with her hair, still gold, still alive, dulled and grey at the tips by soot. Her boots sank to the ankle in places where the ground had turned to powder, where city became desert, became memory. She knelt, and her hair slid forward, pooling beside his shoulder, bright against the ruin. Her hands hovered the way hands do when they know they can't fix the thing they love, then settled anyway, one against his cheek, one over the hammerhead, as if she might hold both and keep the gap between them from widening. "You kept your promise," she said, and her voice didn't break, because some griefs don't go up or down, they go in. She didn't weep then. Weeping is for rooms and doors and nights that end. There was no room here, no door, only sky, and the clean cut of finality. Around them, the last fights dimmed. In one direction, fire dwindled into sullen seams, lava hardening into black ropes. In another, a wind like old breath pushed away a curtain of smoke to show a field of spears standing upright with no hands to hold them. If anyone had been there to listen close, they might have heard the spears thinking, puzzled at being left without purpose. Sif lifted the hammer by its handle, the familiar weight fighting her wrist in that old, short way. It hummed faint, instinctual, like a child murmuring in sleep. She held it with both hands and placed it across Thor's chest, a line drawn where lines had always been his work. When the hammer met him, the air around his body altered barely. A soft pressure eased, a tension unwound. It felt less like goodbye, and more like a pause that no one could measure. "Rest," she whispered, and only then did her eyes spill. Tears made clean tracks through the soot on her face, carving two small rivers amid the grey. Footsteps came rough through the ash. Two pairs, one quick with a bite of anger in it, one heavier with a certainty no age could give yet. Moddy and Magni stood at the edge of the ruin and did not ask what had happened. They looked once at their father, once at the hammer, and then both boys knelt. Moddy's mouth pressed thin the way Thor's did when he refused to yield. Magni touched the short handle like a pilgrim touches a narrow doorframe that 1,000 hands have polished. "It's ours to carry," Moddy said, but his voice had a question in it. "Together." Magni answered. He slid his hand beneath his father's and found that even in death, the grip had left a warmth against the wood. He didn't end it. He only held it back, like always. They did not lift Mjolnir then. Not yet. The hammer had a way of telling you when. They sat with Sif, not speaking, as the ash thinned and drifted, and the first small wind of a new weather moved across the wasteland. In that breath there was something like a future thin, inexperienced, but with a spine. Across a ridge where the serpent's thrashing had carved a trench, a pair of figures picked their way down a slope of cooling glass. Not gods, not giants, not warriors from halls of dead kings. Two humans thin, soot-streaked, barefoot, each holding the other's wrist in that way that makes 4 bones into a single hinge. Leif and Lifthrasir walked like people who remembered what grass felt like even when there wasn't any. Their bellies were empty, and their eyes had the far-off glass of hunger, but their faces' strange miracle carried a calm you only see on mornings when no bad news has arrived yet. They did not approach the gods. They did not know what gods looked like without palaces behind them. They found a piece of ground where ash packed hard over old soil and sat, backs together, heads tilted to the side like they were listening for a spring. After a while the boy, because he was still a boy, in all the ways that matter, said, "We should look for seeds." The girl nodded, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. Water first. They rose and went toward a smear of green that had no right to be there. In the crease between 2 cooled waves of lava, moss had found an edge. It didn't look like hope. It looked like stubbornness, which is more useful, far away. Where Asgard had been an address and now was an outline, the bones of the great hall stood like ribs. A wind moved through them and made a sound not unlike a sigh. Odin was not there to hear it. The ravens wheeled, calling for someone who wouldn't answer anymore, their circles loose, then tighter, then loose again, as if questions themselves couldn't decide how to grieve. At the edge of what had been a forest, a giantess watched the smoke thin. She had no love for gods, but she had less love for emptiness. Jarnsaxa's hair was matted with ash, her eyes red but unbroken. She saw the woman with the gold hair and the boys with the set mouths and knew them by the shape of their grief. She did not go to them. There are distances decorum keeps even after the end. She turned instead to where boulders had trapped a stream and began pulling rocks aside, hands bleeding on the sharp parts. When the water finally pushed through, it didn't rush. It moved like someone coming back to a house they'd left in anger slowly, ashamed, but moving. Jarnsaxa stepped back to let it pass, and if she looked in the direction of the body on the plain, no one could say. Toward noon, not that noon meant much in a sky still figuring itself out, Magni stood. He wiped his palm against his leg the way Thor had done when he was about to lift something worth lifting. He wrapped his fingers around the short handle and waited. Mjolnir was heavy. It had always been heavy. But the heavy felt like agreement, not refusal. He raised it an inch, another, until the head left Thor's chest and the air made a small sound, a pressure release, like the cork of a bottle easing up instead of popping. Modi placed his hand over Magni's, and the weight shifted again, equalizing. For a heartbeat the 2 of them wobbled, learning the new geometry of shared strength. Then it settled, and they did not wobble anymore. Sif exhaled. The sound was small, and it travelled a long way. They carried Mjolnir not with ceremony, but with the care you give to sleeping children and lit stoves. There was no procession, no war song. They laid the hammer carefully at Sif's feet. For the first time since she arrived, her mouth softened at the corners. She touched both boys' faces, forehead and cheek with the backs of her fingers. "Your father kept the wall," she said. "You will build the house," where Modi asked, not to doubt her, but because the question has to be asked at the edge of emptiness. "Where the water moves," she said, glancing toward the slow thread Jarnsaxa had freed. "Where ash thins, where the ground remembers how to hold roots." A shape moved in the distance, huge and slow. For a moment Magni braced, ready to learn fighting again without a teacher. But the silhouette resolved into something that didn't care about them at all, an ancient tree. Yggdrasil's child, or cousin, or rumour, still standing in one valley where the fires had licked and then passed. Its top branches had turned to charcoal, but the lower limbs were alive. Birds not many, but some sat there and shook soot from their feathers, then tried a short, suspicious song. Leif and Lifthrasir came back with hands wet and a notch in the ground where water had pooled. They had found a bag made from someone's old cloak, and inside lay 5 things that looked like stones until you touched them, and they softened into potential. Seeds. They crouched and pressed each into earth still warm from catastrophe, then covered them with ash in little domes like sleeping mice. When they needed a tool, Magni handed them the hammer and watched with eyes big and respectful as they used the flat edge to tamp soil carefully, the way a baker presses down dough. He had seen Mjolnir crush skulls and sanctify marriages. He hadn't seen it coax beans into making decisions. "There," Liv said, satisfied, and for the first time she smiled in a way that was not about endurance. Far off, in a place where sea met new land, something bright flickered and went out. Surt had sunk his sword's tip into the waves before he fell, and there it smouldered under the surface, cooling, leaking light. Fish came near, then away, then near again, curious as only fish can be. Close by, the air changed. You couldn't see it if you were looking, only feel it if you weren't an easing of pressure on the back of the eyes, a lifting somewhere in the soft tissue at the top of the throat. The world unclenched. The quiet that followed was not the quiet of shock anymore. It was the quiet of a big thing having finally happened and the small things getting back to work. Sif rose. She took a breath that had a sound. "Help me," she told the boys. Together they eased Thor's body up the slope where ash gave way to dirt, where a ring of stones suggested a hearth someone had used once and might use again. They laid him there and smoothed the ground around him with the flats of their hands. Sif braided dry grasses into a cord and wrapped it round his wrist and then around the hammer's handle and tied it. The knot was ugly and strong. She spoke without raising her voice. "You held the flood. You held the cold. You held the dark until morning had time to remember itself." She paused. "We will eat because you stayed standing." The words weren't magic. They didn't need to be. They were a receipt. Moddy dug into a scrap of leather at his belt and pulled out the little iron hammer amulet he'd carried since he'd had a neck to carry it on. It was black with sweat and time, edges dulled by thumbprints. He set it on Thor's chest beside the real thing. People made these because they were afraid, he said. Afraid and hopeful at the same time. Magni nodded. Let them keep making them. They sat with him until the light tilted in that way that says afternoon, even if there's no sun to name it. When the air cooled enough to bring back shivers, they stood. Sif took one last look, not in case there was something she'd missed, but so that later she could close her eyes and be sure she hadn't. Then she turned toward the trickle of water. Work gathers around water the way stories gather around trouble. They found people, or the people found them. A woman with a limp and a boy missing 2 front teeth. A man so thin his shadow looked thicker than he did. A cluster of children who had learned to carry silence like a blanket. None of them asked for gods. They asked for a place to lie down that wasn't still warm from burning. They asked for food not because they wanted it, but because the body doesn't care about your philosophy. They asked for a tomorrow that had measurements. Magni and Modi learned how to answer with fences and fire rings and sticks laid over mud to make a floor. They learned the weight of a gate that doesn't swing properly yet, the rhythm of chopping wood in a world where the sound echoes too far. Mjolnir hung on a peg between uses, not a trophy, not a threat, a tool. When storms came, and storms do, even after the biggest one, Magni touched the hammer's head to the doorframe and watched people breathe easier. When a child cried. Moddy tapped the haft gently against the lintel, and the sound was a low, warm note that made the crying stop sooner. At night, when the work had the decency to pause, Sif told them about rain that didn't hiss when it hit the ground, about wheat heavy enough to bow, about bees that went home heavy and not lost. She told them about the day Thor learned the short handle by heart, how he stopped complaining about the design and started standing farther forward in the fight, how imperfect became exactly right for this. The boys listened with their elbows on their knees and their hands folded the way men do when they've earned being still. Sometimes they laughed at the parts with Loki and bridal veils, sometimes they didn't. Once, when the new moon was the kind that you don't see so much as feel a lessening of dark rather than an adding of light. Sif took Mjolnir and walked alone to the ridge. Jan Saxa was there, arms bare, scarred, hair tied back with a strip of cloth that had been a banner once. They stood a few strides apart and considered one another. History lay between them like a tool someone hadn't cleaned. "You loved him," Jan Saxa said, not as question. "Yes," Sif said. The word was easy. "You still do?" "Of course." Jan Saxa looked out over the new camp, the small lights, the smaller noises. He thought he had to be a wall. He was, Sif said. "But walls make rooms. I'll build them. You'll guard the water. The boys will learn doors." Jan Saxa surprised herself by smiling. "And the world will insist. It always does. They didn't touch. They didn't need to. Agreements made without hands sometimes last longer. By mid-season, whatever season this new place had decided it was, the green had a sound to it. You don't notice when plants are thinking unless the land has been so quiet that any life is a drum, The beans made their piping rustle. The barley rubbed shoulders. A small wind figured out which direction it preferred to come from. Under the earth, roots found one another in the dark and shook hands. Leaf and Lifthrasir taught the children how to listen for water under soil with their ear to a stick. They taught men who had swung swords to swing scythes at the right angle, so the grass lay down polite instead of offended. They showed a boy who had kneecaps like opinions how to find chicken eggs by looking not for chickens but for places a chicken might have decided she was safe. When those eggs went into a pan over a stone stove, even the air leaned closer to smell. Sometimes, in the afternoons when heat lays a hand on your shoulder and says sit, Sif let her hair down and combed it with a bone comb. Little kids came near to watch the sunlight thread itself back and forth through it. She laughed a little under her breath and told them a prank story that ended with a promise turning into gold. They clapped in the wrong places and she didn't correct them. Not all the giants were gone. You don't get rid of winter by killing one woman who personifies flood or by cracking one stone man. Across the ridge, beyond the new houses, a shape sometimes lifted above the line of the hills, huge, patient, not interested in what anyone thought. Skrymir slept there. On evenings when thunder walked around without choosing a direction, he opened one eye as if to check whether the little ones were still alive, then closed it again. The mountains didn't go anywhere. They never do. They only pay attention when the loud parts stop. One evening, Magni climbed to the place where the sky feels closer to bone and set Mjolnir on a flat rock. He drew a circle around it with his heel. The circle wasn't magic. It was habit. He sat and said, "I don't know which fights to pick." He said it like a man talks to a tool he trusts to hear him without giving advice. A wind came up a good one, with a bread smell in it. It moved the hammer's leather strap just enough to make a soft creak. Magni nodded. "Work first," he translated. "War if needed." He lifted Mjolnir and stood, same as before, below. Modi was teaching a boy how to stand square to split a log without the axe skittering and helping you regret your thumbs. "Feet like this," he said, tapping the boy's boots into line. "Look, the crack already knows where it wants to go. You just help it finish." The boy swung. The log sighed apart like it had been waiting since morning to do that. Night arrived honest. Stars returned one at a time, shy at first, then bolder. The sky found a colour that wasn't ash anymore, and the black between stars turned back into velvet instead of smoke. Someone tuned a harp whose strings had shrunk and stretched in heat and cold, and it took a while to get a sound that didn't complain. When the notes came clean, they were plain, and that was perfect. Sif stood at the camp's edge with Mjolnir balanced on her palm, feeling its hum go through her arm and into her chest. She remembered the first time she'd seen Thor put it on a table like a loaf of bread. Casual, heavy, essential. She remembered the day he learned to bless a door with it as easily as he broke a gate. She thought he grew. She thought we will too. She lifted the hammer and traced a small sign in the air over the sleeping houses. It didn't flash. It didn't blaze. It didn't do anything you could point to and say there. But everyone sleeping there turned a little deeper toward comfort, and the dream steadied, and the wind decided to step lighter past the eaves. At the far edge of the new fields, Lifthrasir listened hard to the ground, the way you listen to someone you love when they're nearly done talking. He smiled. "Tomorrow," he told the dark, "we'll put in more." He didn't say what. Seeds, yes. Work, yes. Friendship, yes. The word more did the lifting. A fox walked along the fence line like a thought you pretend you didn't have. It nosed the post where Modi had rubbed the hammer earlier and sat back on its haunches. Puzzled. After a while it decided the world, though changed, still had rabbits in it and went to find some. There were nights when storms came honest ones, not angry on purpose, just full of themselves. Rain rattled on the new roofs. People rolled over and went back to sleep. Someone got up to put a pot under a drip and muttered, "We'll fix that tomorrow." Thunder kept a respectful distance, like a familiar who knows you need rest. Magni sometimes went out and leaned against a door jamb and watched the lighting flicker where it wouldn't bother crops, more than once. He felt a crackle go up his forearm and smiled, and if anyone asked why, he'd shake his head and say, "He's checking on us." Once, when dawn came in with fog like a soft excuse, Sif climbed the ridge again. The shape on the plain where they had left Thor was not a grave. There are words for burial that didn't fit here. It was a place, That's all. The grass hadn't returned yet, but small things had made a start, 2 weeds with ideas, a patch of ground that was almost ready to be muddy. She sat and said nothing for so long that her breath forgot to be loud. Then she said, "They're fine," and put her palm on the dirt, and I am too, some days. The dirt didn't answer, but it held her warmth when she took her hand away. Toward evening, Moddy and Magni stood side by side at the edge of the fields. They had the look men get when the day has been good enough to make sleep possible. Children ran a ragged path between cook fires, laughing the way children do when the grown-ups aren't pretending everything's okay. They actually believe it might be. Sif stirred a pot. Lif and Lifthrasir argued about where to put the next fence. Smiling too much for it to be a real argument, Jan Saxa sat on a rock and sharpened a tool that hadn't decided yet whether it was for war or for wheat. Magni hefted Mjolnir one-handed and rested it on his shoulder. Casual. "Tomorrow?" he asked. "Tomorrow," Moddy said. "For him," Magni added, and they didn't need to say the name. The hammer, old and young at once, hummed low. It didn't sound like thunder exactly. It sounded like a barn door closing right the first time. It sounded like a post-set plum. It sounded like a fence that would hold. Night slid down, friendly this time. The first owl of the new world tried a call and surprised itself with how well it did. Somewhere far away. Skrymir turned in his sleep and made a small valley without meaning to. The sea free now of a snake that had made it mean learned to make small, well-behaved waves again, the kind that talk you towards sleep. And under all of it, if you pressed your ear to the ground, you could still hear them 9 echoes, far apart now, fading, but not gone. Steps that said a thing that doesn't need words. Hold. 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 Morning arrived without ceremony, just a softer kind of light and a breeze that smelled like damp earth, and something green trying again. The camp stirred slowly. Someone coughed. Someone yawned. Someone laughed once and then did it again because it felt good on the second try. Pots clinked. A child announced, with utter confidence, that today was for berries, whether the world agreed or not. Magni stood at the fence line and ran his palm along the top rail. It was straight enough to trust. Beyond it, the new barley showed its first pale beards, a fuzz of promise over dark soil. Moddy joined him, carrying Mjolnir in the casual way that looks like ease only after months of bruises. He set the hammer on the post and let it hum through the wood. The rail steadied just a breath, just enough to notice if you were the sort of person who notices fences. "You hear it?" Moddy asked. Magni nodded. "It wants work." "Good. So do we." They started the circuit, the way their father used to know attendance, no speech. Touch the hinge, check the latch, nudge the stone that thinks it can wander. Here and there they'd raise the hammer and draw a small sign over a doorway, a quiet blessing that didn't glow or roar, just settled into the grain and waited there like a steadied hand. People stepped out and touched their chests out of habit. The habit fit. Near the water, Jan Saxa had a line of broad-shouldered teenagers hauling stones out of the stream bed to shape a sluice. She didn't bark orders. She just lifted the heaviest one and set it where it needed to go. The rest of the work learned its manners. Sif stood in the shade of a half-made awning, measuring the distance between posts with a cord and a kind of patient authority that made arguments unnecessary. Children orbited her, some carrying pegs in their fists like trophies, some dragging coils of twine, one determinedly transporting a single nail from one table to another and back again. When Magni and Moddy approached, she paused and met their eyes. No worry there now, just the steady light of a person who has chosen her job and intends to do it until the roof doesn't leak. "Eastgate sags," Moddy said. "I know," Sif answered. "I'm not done with it yet." He smiled. "You sound like him. I'm counting on it," she said, and got back to the cord. By midday, heat lay low over the field and pushed everyone towards shade and water. Leif and Lifthrasir had turned a hollow into a trough fed by a trickle from the hill. People cupped their hands, drank, wiped their mouths with the backs of their hands, first in habit, then in gratitude. The water tasted faintly of stone and relief. Someone splashed and got pretend angry. Someone else made a quick high whistle that meant there. A dog that had survived on nerve alone decided that today was the day it belonged to somebody. That afternoon, a wind came up and played with the barley, laying it down in gentle waves, then letting it stand again. The sound it made had a memory in it, distant fields, harvest that had once been normal, a rhythm people had lived inside without thinking. camp stood and listened the way you do for a song you've almost remembered. Sif closed her eyes and let it pass over her skin until her shoulders lowered without her telling them to. At the far edge of the fields, a boy fell. The cry was small, more surprise than pain, but it carried. Moddy was there before the second sob, kneeling, palm to the kid's shoulder. A splinter had gone deep. He could have barked, "Be brave." He could have said, "Walk it off." He didn't. He took Mjolnir, pressed the cool head against the boy's forearm, and said nothing at all while the pain ran its course and then let go. The boy watched his face the whole time and learned something no hammer in the world can teach with noise. When evening began to think about happening, the camp gathered without anyone calling for it. A circle formed scruffy, mismatched, perfect. Bread came around, the kind you tear, not slice. A stew passed from hand to hand, each person taking enough and leaving enough. A woman with a voice like cedar sang 2 lines of something old, stopped, then tried again and got the notes right. The fire spoke in that calm way that means the wood was chosen well and stacked better. Magni stood, Mjolnir at his side, and cleared his throat. He wasn't a speech maker. His father hadn't been either. He waited until the quiet was true and then let the words arrive at their own speed. "We'll raise the hall tomorrow," he said. "Posts first. Ridgepole after noon if the wind minds itself. Bring whatever you've got, rope, hands, a song that keeps a rhythm." He looked toward the ridge where the earth remembered a larger weight. "We'll do it close," he added, and that was all he said about the place where thunder had stopped. Moddy lifted the hammer. The head caught the last of the light and held it, the way a calm lake keeps a sunset longer than the sky does. He lowered it and put it on the ground. People exhaled. Plans arranged themselves without argument. Later, when the stars came out like a cough that turns into real breathing, Magni and Modi walked the line one more time. The night had the feel of a hand on the back, steady, encouraging, not urgent. Somewhere above, an owl auditioned for the job of first owl of the new world and got it on the 3rd try. Across the plain, a mountain decided to be blue again tomorrow. They stopped at the place where ash still thinned and the weeds had declared their intent. Mjolnir went down between them, and together they stood a while. No talk. Not grief like before, not triumph either. Something in between that doesn't get a name because names are for edges. "I keep hearing them," Moddy said at last. "The steps." Magni nodded. "Me too." "What do we do with that walk?" Magni answered. And they did, back toward the camp where a baby had decided to practice existing, and the fire had decided not to go out. Dawn was all action. Stakes thumped, ropes tightened. Someone shouted ready, and enough people were ready that the word didn't have to get louder to matter. The first post went up with a grunt and a laugh, the second with a worse grunt and a better laugh. At the third, the line slipped and the beam swung and would have broken a collarbone if Jan Sax's hand hadn't been there, catching it like it was a thing you could ask to behave and expect obedience. After that, people listened when she said now. By midday, the frame stood. You could see through it, which is the polite way frames begin. Sif climbed the ladder with a bundle of thatch under one arm and looked down over the circle. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. She set the first reed in place like a sentence that knows where it's going. Moddy stood at the base with Mjolnir, touching the post when the weight settled, letting the hum go into the wood so the fibres remembered how to hold each other. When they set the ridgepole, the whole camp breathed out one of those breaths that belongs to a group and makes everyone a little giddy. Magni leaned his shoulder into the final push, felt the beam find its socket, heard the little click no one else heard. The hammer rang once, low. It sounded like there. As the shadows stretched, they hung charms over the doorway. Not jewels, not teeth. The small things that survive ends a child's bent nail. A strip of cloth from a shirt that somehow didn't burn. A smooth stone someone had kept in a pocket for years to give their thumb something to do while waiting for news. Sif took the cord she'd measured with and tied it around the lintel, then stepped aside. Magni lifted Mjolnir. He didn't raise it high. He pressed it lightly against the wood and held it there. The wordless part of the blessing moved out from the spot, through grain and peg, across beam and brace, into the idea of shelter. People felt it in their teeth, then relaxed because nobody minds a feeling in their teeth if it means the roof will hold. Inside, while the light was still kind, the camp filed through and touched the centre post. Some pressed their foreheads to it. Some just brushed it with the backs of their fingers the way you touch a sleeping dog. A girl stood on her toes and tried to hear the woods answer. She tilted her head, nodded, and said, very seriously, "It says okay." No one laughed at her. They took the word and ended the day with it. That night, the wind made an old sound at the eaves, the hiss that means weather is practicing, not performing. Sif lay with her eyes open a while and listened for thunder. When it came, it was far off, content to be horizon noise. She smiled once, small, and closed her eyes. On the ridge, Moddy kept first watch. He didn't need to. Not really. Habit is a kind of prayer. He let his hand rest on the hammer's head and felt the same slow hum that had settled fences and door frames all day. He thought of his father walking a line that could never be finished, and of the 9 steps that had said more than eulogies ever could. He thought of tomorrow rope to tighten, field to check, a boy to teach how to carry water without wearing it, a plank that would argue and then agree. What survives, Magni had asked earlier, not expecting an answer. Now, in the quiet, the answer came simple. What we do next. The stars leaned in, interested. The new moon kept its secrets. Down in the hall, if it could be called a hall, yet someone snored. And somebody else answered with a snore of a different key until the two of them made a chord you couldn't pay money for. Morning would come the way mornings do, late enough to be forgivable, early enough to be useful. There would be rain to welcome and leaks to deny. There would be wolves to discourage and children to chase away from tools and towards sleep. There would be 1,000 nearly invisible victories and 1 or 2 failures that would teach better than speeches. And in the middle of it, there would be a hammer on a peg, humming the note that says, hold here, hold now, hold for 1 more night, 1 more storm, 1 more season, and then another, after thunder. That is what survives, not the noise, not the bright tearing of the sky, but the steadiness that comes after. The hands on wood, the fence that stays, the door that swings true, the quiet promise that lets people rest. So when the wind pushed at the eaves, and the hall answered without complaint, when the barley lay down and stood back up again, when the dog decided to belong and the fox decided to wait till morning, when Jansaxa sharpened a tool that finally chose wheat, when Leif and Lifthrasir argued gently about where to plant the next row, and agreed without saying the word, when all of that happened and kept happening, it felt like thunder doing its best work. And if, sometimes, the ground underfoot carried a faint echo 9 steps, far apart now, softer each week that was only the world remembering, not to hurt, to hold,